You're listening to Autumn on the Air, the weekly podcast that brings you conversations about the impact of research commercialization and the people who make it happen. Join us for interviews with patent and licensing professionals, innovators, entrepreneurs, and tech transfer leaders on the issues and trends that matter most. Keep listening for an inside track on the people, IP policies, and politics changing our world.
Welcome to Autumn on the Air. Today we have a truly distinguished guest joining us, Dr. Yasheng Huang, the Epic Foundation Professor of Global Economics and Management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Yasheng is a leading authority on the Chinese economy, technology policy, and innovation systems. He earned both his BA and PhD in government from Harvard University and has held faculty positions at the University of Michigan and Harvard Business School before joining MIT in 2003. At MIT, he founded the China Lab, India Lab, and Yasheng Lab, providing consulting services to hundreds of small and medium enterprises. Yasheng is a prolific scholar, having authored 13 books in English and Chinese, including the acclaimed Capitalism and Chinese Characteristics, which was selected as a best book of 2008 by The Economist, and The Rise and Fall of the East, named the best book of 2023 by Foreign Affairs. His research spans economic development, technology transfer, entrepreneurship, and regulatory policy. He has served as a consultant to the World Bank, Asia Development Bank, and OECD, and currently serves as president of the Asian American Scholar Forum. Yasheng is also a member of the Asia Society's Task Force on U.S.-China Relations and recently joined the Asia Society Policies Institute Center for China Analysis as a non-resident honorary senior fellow focusing on the Chinese economy and technology. Today, we'll be discussing his recent thought-provoking article published in Nature, Universities Must Harness Their Financial Value, which addresses the critical challenges facing American research universities and proposes innovative solutions for their sustainability. Welcome to the podcast, Yasheng. So excited to have you here on the air.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for doing this.
Well, really appreciate you being here. And I really loved your Nature article because I think it really invites universities to engage in a conversation that we really need to have right now. And your article is really neat in the fact that it opens with a very striking comparison. And the comparison you make is that endowments of the top 10 wealthiest U.S. universities combined are smaller than Elon Musk's individual fortune at $455 billion. Can I ask you, why did you choose to frame the issue this way? And what do you think it tells us about how misunderstood the true value of research universities is?
Yeah, I wanted to start the article on that point to make a correction to a common perception that the universities are pampered, are rich beyond the imagination. Usually the media also goes with it, right? When they talk about Harvard, they say, oh, Harvard has $50 billion of endowment. You know, $50 billion is a lot of money. There's no question about it. MIT, my own university, 30 something. It's a lot of money. But we have to have some perspective on the relative wealth positions of universities vis-a-vis other actors in the society, in the economy. And I pointed out that if you added up the endowments of 10 richest universities in America, it is about $270 billion, give and take. And then you look at one individual, Elon Musk, his wealth is $450 billion. And in fact, as we are speaking today, his board is considering to approve a pay package for him of $1 trillion. So, you know, it has to be the case that either that our society is just massively wrong about that allocation, rewarding one individual $450 billion vis-a-vis the 10 top research universities in the world, or that one individual has created more value than the historical accumulation of the 10 top research universities, right? And I have to say, I don't think the second proposition sounds remotely reasonable and plausible, right? So then we have to come back to this question, is this the right allocation of money and resources in our society? And what is the reason for the current pattern of resource allocation? And what are the conditions upon which this resource allocation works? And so we will explore those issues in our conversation.
Absolutely. It's interesting to me. You mentioned historical accumulation. I think people forget that is an act, it took these universities a long time to build those endowments. Whereas Mr. Musk, I don't know the exact numbers, how long it took him to build his wealth, but it certainly wasn't as long as these universities took to accumulate their endowments.
Yeah. Well, I mean, talking about my own university, MIT invented radar during the Second World War.
Exactly.
And these 10 research universities go back to 17th century, 18th century, 19th century. So we're talking about cumulative. If you think about accumulation vis-a-vis what Elon Musk has done in the past maybe 20 years or 30 years, the contrast is even more remarkable.
That's right? What I was thinking. It's more stark when you think about it. That's why I caught on the historical accumulation.
Yeah, the disparity is even more stark if you take into account the accumulation.
Now, you also cite some compelling data that shows that MIT alumni-founded companies constitute the economy equivalent to the 10th largest country in the world, about 1.9 trillion as of 2014. But this is something, obviously, universities can't claim as value on their balance sheets. So can you elaborate a bit on this value creation paradox and why it matters to how we think about university wealth?
Well, it matters because we typically don't think about universities when we talk about GDP growth, wealth creation, and we may think about certain individual pieces of technologies like medicine and things like that. And even there, the general public doesn't really make a connection between the devices they use and the universities. Most of the people in the society think about universities as classrooms, right? Students go, professors lecture, and that's about it. That's a very important part of the university. There's no question about it. Knowledge, education of the next generation of people. But a very important part of the university is also conducting research on science, technology, on social science, humanities. And a lot of the technologies that we use, the medicines that we take, originally came from that kind of research. But people don't know, right? They look at Elon Musk. He created the Tesla car, and people think, oh, Elon Musk is responsible for that. But if you trace many of these technologies, ultimately you trace them to universities. Stanford, for example, Google came from two students at Stanford when they were studying at Stanford. So I understand why people don't make that connection. In the past, they didn't need to make that connection. Universities didn't need to make that connection. But the study that you identified was an attempt to make that connection. And there was a similar study on Stanford that also shows that Stanford created responsible for the creation value around the same amount, 11th or 10th largest GDP in the world. So the point of the studies is to show that universities, ultimately speaking, are also responsible for economic growth, for the wealth creation. And the reason why universities don't directly benefit financially from this impressive wealth creation is because the role of the government, the federal support of the research. So I still think that's the best situation, that's the best state of affairs for the government to support the research, for the universities to supply knowledge, to train the next generation of scientists and technologists and professionals. But the problem is that the federal government has decided, under the current administration, has decided not to do that. Then in my article, I argued, then we need to rethink about this model. I still insist that the system that we had is still the best model. But to the extent we cannot have that, we need to think about something else.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to talking about that some more during the podcast. But before we get to that, I wanted to get your thought on something. I don't know if you're familiar with the New York Times reporter Kate Zernike. She wrote a book called The Exceptions about women in science at MIT, but she has a grandfather who was a Nobel Prize winning scientist. Her father was a scientist. So she writes a lot of articles for the New York Times about research and university research. And we had her on a couple of weeks ago to talk about what was happening with the federal funding. And her take was that universities have a communication problem when it comes to their research. They don't do a good job. And I think you just alluded to this in some of your answer, that they don't do a good job of communicating what they are doing for society and the impact it has on society. And she said that what university researchers should say to the general public is that I work for you, that I am creating solutions to problems that maybe you don't appreciate that you have for many years down the road. I'm curious to get your view on that.
Yeah, so by the way, I read her book, Exception. It's a book about Nancy Hopkins.
Yes, Nancy Hopkins. Yep.
MIT professor. It was really just amazing book about the path-breaking Nancy Hopkins. I agree and I disagree. She's right that universities don't do a lot of communication. But on the other hand, universities in the past took it for granted that their role, their value, were understood by the government, if not by the general public. I mean, to be honest, to communicate about what universities do, especially on the research side, is actually extremely complicated. It's not that easy to communicate. And universities do all sorts of things, right? So there are all kinds of technologies, there are all kinds of scientific knowledge. Which one do you communicate about, right? And now universities tend to talk about medicine, tend to talk about biotech. But we know that universities don't just do medical research. The universities do lots of other research. And so it's not that easy to communicate about those things that universities do, especially on the research side. And what is communicated a little bit is on the education side. I do believe that we ought to communicate more about the educational side. But the thing is, in a good society, everybody has a division of labor. We academics tend to work, in our offices, in the labs, and, kind of devoted to that. And we're not terribly good at outside communication. And there are, Steve Jobs and Yasheng Huang of NVIDIA, the business people, Elon Musk, they are good at creating the one technology that they work on, and they are also great at communication. So I don't see any intrinsic problem with that arrangement. As long as universities are being supported by the society, and the need to communicate arises because that support is no longer as guaranteed as it was before. But I believe that no matter how much we communicate, no matter how clever we are becoming communicators, I don't think that's going to solve the problem. I really don't think it's about communication. Part of it is communication, and we definitely should do better. But I just don't think that improving communication can solve the problem we're facing.
I want to go back to something you alluded to, because you were talking about the relationship between universities and society. And in your paper, you talk about that as being the social compact, where universities create knowledge as a public good in exchange for federal funding and tax benefits. Talk to us how this compact's evolved over the past decades and all the different threats that it's facing today. I mean, we've alluded to some of them with the current administration.
Yeah, so the compact was formed after the Second World War. And MIT had a role in creation of that compact. It was a MIT professor, Vanessa Bush, who wrote a memo, I think Frontiers of Science or Frontiers of Knowledge, and that laid out the design for the science funding system. The National Science Foundation, NIH, all these funding agencies were created on the basis of that blueprint. That was critical in pivoting the U.S. to the top of science and technology. It pivoted U.S. universities to the global best in both in research and education, and it pivoted the U.S. to the production of these breakthrough knowledge and breakthrough technologies after the Second World War. And then in the late 1970s, Congress reformed a piece of legislation that governs the ownership of the knowledge created as a result of the federal support. And it decentralized the ownership of that knowledge, gave the knowledge basically to the universities. And then the universities, as a result of that, universities had more freedom with the usage of the IP, the intellectual property right. And the end result of that was the entrepreneurship that came from the university system, MIT, Stanford especially, although there are other universities that are also creating incredible entrepreneurships. So we have all these sort of pieces together, right? We have the federal funding, and then we have the creation of ventures on the basis of the knowledge being funded by the federal government. And then we have the universities continue to supply public knowledge, continues to supply breakthroughs to the society without taking a direct equity stake in these creations, right? So that's the piece, that's the social compact that we had prior to the Trump administration, the second Trump administration. And now the federal support piece is being shaken and undermined. That's a critical piece to make that social compact work. So that's the situation we're in.
Yeah, and your article references the funding pauses, the suspensions to universities, the proposed budget cuts to the NIH and NSF, and the potential 21% tax on endowment income. So I'm curious, from your perspective as someone who studies institutional economics, what are the long-term implications of these policy shifts for American scientific leadership?
Well, I think the science is becoming more expensive to do, both in terms of money and then in terms of people. So AI may solve the people, but at least now it is still very people intensive. There's a study on Moore's law, right? And which is that to kind of fulfill the predictions of the Moore's law, now you have to use, my memory may not be exactly right, but something like 17 times as many people as you would in the 1970s. So if you go to a lab and you see a lot of people doing experiments, postdoc, research scientists, professors, undergraduate research assistants, scientific enterprise, it uses a lot of people. It's not just a professor at the very top. It is a team, right? So if you read a scientific paper, it has, sometimes 30, 40 names and 20 names. And sometimes the list of the names is longer than the article itself. And so the equipment, has to be tailor-made in some cases. It has to be made exactly right. So it costs a lot of money. In fact, in that book about Nancy Hopkins, what Professor Hopkins did to show the bias at MIT against female professors was that she measured the size of the labs. And then she found out that the labs run by female professors were smaller than the labs run by male professors, right? And then the equipment and allocation was systematically biased against the female professors. So that's a little bit sort of not related to the point, but the point is that scientific enterprise uses a lot of equipment, uses a lot of materials to cultivate a rat for experiment. It costs a lot of money. I mean, all these rats that they, mouse, right? I don't know what's the term, to do the research, costs a lot of money. And I want to point out, even before the second Trump administration, the U.S. funding of basic scientific research is not increasing dramatically in terms of the global landscape. China is increasing, and we are not increasing at the rate and the level as China has. So we were already running short of the resources. And now we're talking about this kind of a budget cut. And the other point I want to make is that if you look at the government support for scientific research, that support has been, and this is before the second Trump administration, has been biased toward computer science and biological science. The things in the middle, material science, mechanics, and all these things, the support they got from the federal government is not increasing, right? So if you think about the climate change, if you think about the energy, the new energy, a lot of that research takes a lot of money, and yet they were not being supported as strongly as compared with computer science, as compared with biological science, as needed. So we were already not in a not a great shape before this current attack on universities.
Definitely not. And you call this an existential moment that demands a drastic rethink. So let's start to talk about some of the rethinks. And, you do offer some proposed solutions in your paper. And one of the first ones I wanted to talk about is you noted that MIT received only $40 million in gross licensing income in 2023, which is only a tiny fraction of its almost $5 billion operating budget. So why has traditional patent licensing been so limited as a revenue source? And what would need to change, do you think?
Yeah. So the licensing, the patent licensing, has never been a substantial source of revenue for, I think the biggest one was for Google, and then Stanford, I think, converted their licensing into equity, and then they sold the equity. So they made a lot of money on that. But most of the licenses don't generate the kind of revenue that that Google got. In the case of MIT, I forgot the name of the company, but there was another company that spun out of the MIT that MIT made some more money. But we can count these with 10 fingers. It is not a steady source of revenue. It comes and goes. When you run an organization, when you run a university, you can't really sort of increase employment when you have money and decrease employment when you don't have money. The government support is a steady source of revenue. The donation is a steady source of the revenue, and the donation formed the endowment, and now they are going after the endowment, essentially reducing the value of the donation. So I think it's very important for the general public to know that the attack on the universities constitutes multiple fronts, right? Cutting the support, going after the endowment, and making these demands on universities to change their curriculum, to change their hiring practices. So it's a multi-pronged attack on academia, a very very determined effort to take down the academia. And the reason licensing can never be a substantial source of the revenue is because patents on their own don't generate value. It is patent being applied, being developed, being extended. Maybe in medicine, patent is quite big source and big piece of the IP. But in other areas, a piece of knowledge on a piece of paper has to be developed, has to be implemented, has to be combined with lots of other things. And that development process is the process that generates money, generates revenue. And universities don't do that, right? Universities just have patents, and you come and look at the patent. I'll say, well, this patent is interesting. Let me. But then the corporations, the businesses, develop the knowledge into a product, into a service. And by that time, the value of the patent is already not a substantial part of the value creation, except in medicine. In medicine, I think that's more of the case. And if you think about other kinds of IP, for example, brand, right? If you have a famous brand like Nike or things like that.
Or University of Florida and Gatorade is still getting $20 million a year because of the trademark.
That's right, because of the trademark, right? So, and that's a special case, right? I can't think of anything connected with my own university that has a trademark, but the trademark has to be developed, and it may not be intimately connected with the research activities that we do at a university. So that cannot be a substantial source of revenue as well. So then the question is, are there things that universities can do to increase the licensing revenue? So I want to have that as a discussion. I don't really have, a fixed idea, but I do believe that that maybe universities should invest in efforts to curate IP a little bit more and to look at the patent portfolios that they have, right? If you only license a small fraction of your total patent portfolio, is it really true the rest of the patent portfolio has no value? Maybe the answer is yes, but I don't think any research has been done on that question. We kind of defer to the market. Oh, if the market doesn't pick it up, then it has no value. But we know the market on knowledge market is not a very efficient market. So here maybe the communication is a big piece. If you don't communicate, and if you don't sort of show the value potentials of the patents, maybe the companies don't care what you have, right? So this is really more of a question. I didn't go into that in my article. Should universities take a look at the patent portfolios? And at least at MIT, we have a very good business school, and I'm a professor of that business school. Maybe we should use some of the talents from the business sector to look at the patents and to identify some potential usages, identify some potential applications before we draw the conclusion that simply because there's no company that is asking MIT to license the patent, therefore it has no value, right? So that's one idea that I have been thinking about.
I like that idea. That could be really interesting, where you give students in the College of Business credit, you create a class around this. It would be an interesting just test to see what the value add could be if you gave the students patents in the university's portfolio that weren't actively licensed and had them build a business case for it. It could be very, very interesting.
That's exactly my proposal. We create courses to have our students, at MIT, we have the privilege of having a very strong business school, very strong engineering school. To have courses with both engineering students and business school students, looking at the portfolio of the patents of MIT or of other universities, and identify, what is there that is not being utilized, even as an educational project. I think it's a good course. I would take it if I were a student today, right? And also for students, it would be great for them to find out, what was there in the knowledge creation by these universities. So even if nothing comes out of this, it is a good educational project. And I think, I would definitely propose to people at MIT to create a course like that.
I think I see a lot of value in that. And I hope some of our listeners listening to you describe this will at least give it a try and beta test it. Like you said, the worst is maybe nothing comes out of it, but it's a great educational opportunity.
Yeah. And I happen to think that in this age of AI, we need to innovate on the educational front. And one of the ways to innovate is to have our students work on real world problems rather than just work on textbooks, right? The textbook knowledge can be more easily sourced through AI, but the real world knowledge has to be done by, so far, I think at this point, by people. And so it has that, hopefully it has that benefit as well.
Now, you highlight in your article the Weizmann Institute's technology transfer arm, YEDA, in Israel. as a model that aggressively commercializes its research. So are there things American universities can learn from an international model such as this? And what do you think maybe some of the cultural or structural changes would be to adopt a similar type of approach?
Yeah. So Weizmann does more than just a technology licensing office, what a technology licensing office does. They actually, so let me just say that Weizmann, because they're in life science, so it's a little bit easier. It's a little bit easier than mechanical engineering. So they curate the IP. They actively work on potential business leads, business potentials of the knowledge being created, and then they market, right? So this is where the communication piece comes in. Then they actively promote and market to pharmaceutical companies or biotech. I think American universities, some universities do some of that, and some individual faculty do some of that. I may be wrong, but I don't think American universities have as a substantial operation as Weizmann does on curation, development, and marketing. And we kind of stop at the patent stage and then move on to the next project. If the patent is taken, okay, that's great. Then we move on. We don't sort of pause and work on the next stage. I advocate that we should do more of that. The criticism of that approach is that we corrupt the research incentives of universities. And I do believe that's a serious concern. And because we're a little bit drawn by the money rather than by the next research frontier. I don't pretend to say that this is not a problem. And I want to say that I don't want to do this if we have the continue the government support. But when I talk to my colleagues and they kind of dismiss that, this is going to really undermine the fundamental research and all of that. Well, my argument is cutting your research is going to undermine the fundamental research even more.
Yeah,
right?
I think so, for sure. Yeah.
The academics are incredibly conservative. And I just believe that we need to adjust to the new environment, and not just to this administration, but really to the years ahead. There's going to be a hard time ahead. We cannot just say, okay, let's see what happens next 3 years and maybe the federal funding will come back. As I said before, even before the Trump administration, the second Trump administration, the scientific funding was already not at a level where it should be, right? So it's not like this problem was only created this year. We have had this problem for many, many years, right? So that's my point. We really need to innovate. I have a sentence in the article, we need to innovate our funding system in order to preserve the innovation system. I want to preserve as much as we can the research incentives, tackling the fundamental research issues rather than being led by money. But I argue in my piece, this is a managerial issue. This is an operational issue. This is not an existential issue, right? To conflict the two, I think it's just not looking at the reality in its face. And we really need to take this very, very seriously.
Extremely seriously, because I'm agreeing with you. Even once the Trump administration is over, things are changed, and I don't think we can go backwards. So we have to move forward. So we have to innovate, like you said. And one of the provocative proposals you have in your paper is you talk about maybe universities should tax faculty's external income that they generate from consulting, speaking, and expert testimony. Walk us through the rationale for that, and how would you balance generating revenue without deterring this kind of valuable public engagement?
Well, so again, this is for discussion.
Yeah, it's discussion. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think the devil is in the detail, right? It's just like setting taxes on corporations, on individuals. You don't want to go too high. You don't want to go to zero, right? Exactly where the sweet spot is, I have no idea. But I do believe, the tax setting policy is always about the rate of the tax rather than whether or not you expropriate all the income, or you expropriate no income, right? So then it becomes a technical discussion. It becomes, we can sort of have some discussion on that. The other issue is, I also think I advocate universities taking a more active equity stake and taxing the external engagements by the faculty as an equity issue, right? I mean, universities, you can think about, we have a saying, right? What takes a village to raise a child? It takes a village of a university for faculty to produce research and to teach. So now the way it works is that universities basically treat the faculty as individual contractors. So if a faculty member goes out and create an enterprise, he or she may have an equity stake in it, but the university doesn't. That's great for him or her, but that's not necessarily good for the university and for the colleagues who probably in one way or the other also contributed to the eventual formation of the idea that led to the enterprise creation, right? Who knows? It could be a seminar, it could be a piece of research that another colleague did, right? Universities are all about communication with each other, right? And a seminar series, talks, and all of that. So to isolate, so the current method is to think that, okay, if a company is created, it is because of that professor. Maybe 90% is that professor, but maybe there's a 10% that is a result of the fact that he or she is a member of the faculty, right? I will argue the ratio is probably higher than 10%. And so the current system actually doesn't benefit other potential contributors to this value creation. The same idea about outside engagements, right? I do some of that as a business school professor, and I know, some of my ideas came from conversations and came from this vibrant intellectual life that I'm fortunate to enjoy at MIT, right? No, obviously the eventual thing came from my writing, came from my work with the outside entity, but I know for sure that I benefited from being a faculty member of MIT. I have ideas today that I didn't have before I came to MIT. But I have no way of sharing that benefit with my colleagues, right? So a tax recognizes the public and social nature of university life. And also, MIT has engineers, has business school professors, has economists, and has life scientists. But we also have very strong people who work on music, who work on arts, who work on history. They contribute to the vibrancy of intellectual life of MIT. But we currently don't have any way of transferring some of the financial gains on the part of some of the people in the university to other colleagues, right? So it's a matter of equity as well. But I would argue, I'll be the first one to argue that we shouldn't set the rate so that to reduce these outside engagements, right? These outside engagements keep faculty informed about what's going on in the world, and also rewards the faculty for knowledge and for doing these things. So we definitely should not set the rate too high. But currently it's zero, right? I don't think zero is the right number.
It's definitely an interesting concept that's worth discussion, especially in the new age that we're living in now. And like you said, we have to innovate and get creative so we can continue, doing the research that we're doing. I did want to ask you, I think there's an inherent tension in your proposal. You talk about universities moving forward, capturing more financial value while maintaining their mission to create knowledge as public good. How do we navigate this tension without fundamentally changing what makes universities valuable in the very first place?
Yeah. So I think if the universities want to go in that direction, they should spend 99.9% of the time thinking about that question, right? So if you look at law firms and investment banks, they always have guardrails. Sometimes they call it Chinese wall.
Yep, we
Chinese, do. So I don't quite understand the origin of that word. Separating a company into different parts, and they're not supposed to communicate with each other. So I would strongly advocate, if universities want to go in that direction, they should create a strong financial operational separation between the research side of the university and the development and the side of the university. And, this is not a unheard of practice, right? So many other institutions do that. And I don't see a technical barrier to that. And the other thing is that I would even go further by saying that the current system, by encouraging or at least enabling individual faculty to start enterprises and benefit from financially from the enterprise creation, that also has a incentive complication as well. Whereas if the university officially does this, then at least the university can create solutions and separations, whereas the current system actually doesn't do that, right? So the argument can go either way, and we definitely I don't want MIT, the entire university, to be led by money. That would be really, really wrong. My proposal is, are there incidental business creation values coming from the knowledge creation at MIT that we currently don't recognize? And we should invest some efforts in that recognition and invest some efforts in a creation of a system that doesn't impair the research incentives. I think it can be done. Exactly how it can be done, I don't know. But at least we should start the conversation.
We have to have this conversation. And, you even state in your paper, and I'm going to quote you, you say, academics need to recognize that the social compact between society and universities might not return even after the current political cycle. And that's really a pretty sobering assessment. And assuming you're correct, what do you think American research universities are going to look like in 10 or 20 years?
Yeah. So I think the current crisis is that we may lose people to other countries. And in fact, there was a Nature survey that has it's an unbelievable number. So I don't think it's a realistic number, but it's very high proportion of scientists are at least entertaining the idea of leaving the United States. It's a high number. It is about thinking of leaving, not actually leaving, but we cannot rely on that. The simple fact is that I don't think a year ago or 2 years ago, even a small number of American scientists were thinking about leaving the United States, right? And so this is a crisis that is unfolding. You know, as I said, I'm Chinese. I was born in China, so I'm more familiar with Chinese American scientists, and I know for sure that quite a few of them have left the United States, not just because of the funding cut, but also because of investigations and all of that. So if we think back historically, if one is to ask, in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, who were the top universities in the world? Many of them were German, right? And Germany today, they still have some good universities, but they are nowhere near the ranking of German universities in the first decades of 20th century. What happened? Because they lost scientists. They lost academics.
Yeah, they came to the U.S. to work on the Manhattan Project and other things.
Absolutely, right? So, and the effect is still there today. Look at the disparity between American universities and German universities. So, if you lose a generation of academics, you lose them forever. Look at how Israel became a technological superpower. It was because the Soviet Union in the 1970s began to allow Jews to immigrate outside of the Soviet Union. And there was a agreement between U.S. and U.S. and Soviet Union. I think it's called the Jackson Amendment that obliged the Soviet government to allow Jewish immigration. Many of them came to the U.S. Many of them went to Israel. Those scientists who went to Israel jump-started the technological takeoff of Israel, right? So the movement of human capital, sometimes just a few people can determine the relative power positions, relative economic prosperity of countries for decades to come. So I fear for this moment that the U.S. is losing its talents if we do not reverse the situation. So my proposal is also we should start discussing this issue now to give the scientists, American academics, some what we call option value, some hope that, we are thinking about the solution, right? And we are thinking about working out a solution. So at least a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, we have this alternative mechanism in place. That's much better than telling our academic colleagues, okay, Trump is going to be gone in 2028 and, things would come back. The thing is, the scientists have to make a decision today.
Exactly.
And you can't tell them that in 3 years things will change. But at least if if they perceive universities as being active in coming up with solutions that can potentially work, I hope that's also a talent retention strategy.
I completely agree with you. And, for universities that want to start to think about these things and having a dialogue and develop a plan, what advice would you give to university presidents and tech transfer offices who want to begin this discussion and maybe start implementing some of these ideas?
Well, so I think we should start with the things that the universities are already doing and see if we can improve on the current operations and to think more from a little bit more from the financial side rather than simply from the educational side and research side, right? For example, at MIT, we have a very powerful entrepreneurship center, but they take no equity in the business creation that the center has helped. Maybe should we think about kind of Y Combinator kind of arrangement, mentoring, incubation would lead to some financial stake. So these are the things that at least my university is doing, but then we add to the current operation an additional feature that would hopefully address this issue. So that I think that's the first thing that universities should do. Look at their current operations and think about the ways to leverage the current operations to a better financial future. And the other is, in the same spirit, the portfolio of patents, right? Let's examine the portfolio and see what's there. And the more radical proposal is creating some sort of business development, communication, marketing arm. I think that's going to be a bit more controversial. And then think of ways to safeguard research incentives and research integrity, right? So I would say that these are the things that universities should start thinking about.
Now, finally, as the podcast comes to a close, I wanted to ask you, beyond the funding challenges, what gives you hope about the future of American research universities and their role in driving innovation as well as economic growth?
So let me just say that we have focused on university in our discussion, but the academic freedom is a part and parcel of the larger political, economic, intellectual freedom of American society. And that larger freedom is being threatened by this administration. And I would argue that the American universities, under the current environment, are going to lose its attractiveness to other countries. But that's also a function of the fact that American political system, American society are losing some of its incredibly attractive features that have been so important to immigrants from other countries. So we can't, in our discussion, we didn't talk about this larger issue, but we cannot separate the two issues completely. So the danger is losing the intellectual capital. And once that reallocation has happened, it is going to be very difficult to reverse. This is a generational issue. This is not a short-term issue. In terms of the strength, well, I was heartened by the elections on Tuesday. right? And the not only Democrats won, they won large margins,
Overwhelmingly
everywhere and up and down and all of that. That gave me tremendous hope that American system is still there. It is capable of making self-corrections. If we are going to hold a free and fair election next year, midterm, I am confident that the Democrats are going to come back and constrain the authoritarianism of this administration. Then all these university issues are not going to go away, but at least for academics, they have some confidence that the larger political system is going to be preserved, and then within that system, we can work on some specific innovations related to university research and university education, right? So I think I'm more confident than I was 3 days ago, and I do hope that that universities and president of university, provosts, and deans should start thinking about their own research ecosystem.
Well, Yasheng, thank you so much for spending so much time today. It's a really great article. You provide a lot of really good ideas. And like you said, we need to innovate. So thank you for the piece. And thank you for spending so much time with me today.
Thank you, Lisa. I really enjoyed the conversation and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasheng, for joining us today and sharing your insights on the critical challenges facing research universities and the innovative approaches needed to ensure their sustainability. Yasheng's article in Nature has sparked important conversation across higher education about how universities can adapt to changing political and economic realities while preserving their core mission of creating and disseminating knowledge for the public good. If you'd like to read Yasheng's full article, Universities Must Harness Their Financial Value, it was published in Nature, volume 645, September 25th, 2025. You can also follow Yasheng's work through MIT Sloan or connect with him at Twitter at YASHENGHUANG. Thank you for listening to Autumn on the Air, where we explore the impact of research commercialization and the people who make it happen. Until next time, keep innovating.
Thanks for listening to Autumn on the Air with Lisa Mueller. Get social with us and share your thoughts. You can tweet us at AUTM or visit us online at AUTM.net. We'll be back next week on the air. Be sure to join us.